many of them this morning at some level. Principles having to do with how you scope a model with endogenous, exogenous features having to do with the idea of incrementally building a model instead of building it at once. Okay, but this is incredibly important stuff to practical projects, and so I don't want to give it too short a shrift. My goal here is to proceed through a brief discussion of model conceptualization and then on to model mapping, where we're going to introduce a tool and where Jeff will share some of the wisdom that he's distilled from many years in the modeling space. Okay? Okay. Great. So here I'm going to go to, we're going to leave this. I'll share some trade-offs here between different approaches. Okay, so model conceptualization. Great. Okay, here we go. Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm not seeing the latest, very latest one, but I think it's this one here. Okay. Okay, so I had noted that that model conceptualization is one of the most important components of the modeling process. And I'm going to stop this. Okay, no, keep on going. Okay. So modeling process takes place in a variety of stages. Modeling conceptualization is one of the first components, as is model mapping. And typically, conceptualization takes place before mapping. After that, we go on to formulate a model in a precise enough way that we can run it. And that's called model formulation. Okay. And following that, we're often testing a model in various forms, calibrating it to data, and then when we have requisite confidence using it for example, policy evaluation or knowledge translation. And it's a highly iterative process. As you'll hear, we iterate through this. We change the boundary of what's endogenous and exogenous over time. Now, we're going to be going through these first two here. And as I say, they're squishy. They're hard to sort of bundle into a set of suggestions. There's a protocol which I rather like. People have very mixed opinions on it, called ODD, and a variant ODD plus. Okay, that stands for Overview, Design, and Details, and it's an approach advocated by Volker Grimm for documenting models, but I think it also relates to a certain degree to this kind of mapping out what's in a model, and it helps you think through what goes into a model in a systematic fashion. Helps you think through the features that might go into a model. So I'd recommend it, and there's a book and a set of papers related to that Volker Grimm has contributed. What I want to convey here is that it's enormously beneficial when undertaking modeling to proceed in an incremental fashion, where we build new versions. We dock each new version, the behavior of it, against the older version, often disabling the new features first to see if it matches the behavior, and then turning on those new features and seeing how that behavior changes. Okay? And for that, you're modifying a small bit of the model, testing it against the original model, finding out what's different, making sure it's still consistent with the new feature off. And by so doing, we secure a bunch of advantages. Very importantly, it helps us learn from the model. There's quite a few models out there which I have had people comment on to me, where the model has been built up after many, many months, and it's been run, and there's not clarity at the basis about why you're seeing certain patterns. And it takes a lot of sleuthing to figure out where those patterns come from. And those patterns often come from one of two sources. In the good case, after a lot of sleuthing, you find that they're from this certain area of the model. You enable parameter, you enable pieces of the model, you disable it, you do experiments in a controlled fashion where you're varying parameters in certain ways, and you may eventually track down the source of the interesting behavior. And you've learned something, but it's a lot harder than it would be for the way I'm going to suggest as an alternative. The second possibility is, after a lot of experimentation, you trace the problem down to a bug in the model. And that's disheartening. And it's a lot harder to find that bug because there's a lot of other moving parts in the model right now. So building up a model incrementally, and I mean, you may think the current model is impoverished and nothing like you want to get to, but run it on an ongoing basis. You'll have a better understanding when model patterns come into play, because you'll first observe them when you added this feature. And you'll know, oh, it was just because I added that thing that I start to see this pattern. So you have a clear understanding about why you see behavior with the more complicated model that may eventually result. You have a faster ability to diagnose bugs. If there's a mistake that comes up, if something weird happens, you know, well, I only changed these two things, so you can track it down sooner. Critically, and most importantly, perhaps, you learn along the way, and you can change the direction of where you want to go next. You may think that a year from now, you're going to have this great, rich model with these 10 features in it. And by building it up incrementally, you may have that in a year's time. You may have a model with great 10 features, but the 10 features that you have are much more savvily chosen. You've been much more careful in understanding which features they need to be because you've learned along the way. You've learned early on, oh, it's really sensitive to this, or this thing doesn't seem to matter that much, or this thing here is interacting with this other one in a really interesting way. We need to look into that more. And so it ends up taking the model in a different direction than you thought because you've learned along the way, rather than just staying the course and saying, okay, we're going to end up with a model that is rich and has these features, but then where you have to tease apart to figure out where the behavior is coming from. You can secure feedback from stakeholders along the way. Kurt, who just left the structure, I think, had an excellent experience with this, and it's been something we've repeated in many occasions, is the idea of taking a model, showing it to a stakeholder, running it for them, better yet, having them run it. It's one of the advantages of them coming to boot camps. And then they can provide feedback. And so their feedback goes into shaping the model. And again, you emerge with a much more savvy model. You have greater clarity in sort of prioritizing what to go, enhance stakeholder confidence, and not just waiting a year for the model. They have something in hand, and improve morale. You also can often have a longer lead time to find the data that really matters because you identify sensitivities earlier and can put the effort into that. Okay, thinking through the model. This is the one we are going to use here, okay? This is this one I put up here. Now, I added to it, in this case, interventions, because I'd like to think through explicitly where do interventions affect things. After all, they're one of the big motivations for including certain factors, and I put these states down here. And it turns into parties. Ross's term for it is party, parte, P-A-R-T-E, and I have a different variant. I separate what he has as kind of properties into parameters and states, or properties and states. These are more static characteristic. These are states. This also happens to map really nicely into AnyLogic's way of depicting things, where properties become parameters, actions, rules, and states are either state charts for categorical dynamics or or stocks and flows for continuous dynamics. Those stocks and flows on the one hand, state charts in the other, those will capture the actions, the rules, and the states. Stock is the state. Which state you're in a state chart, that captures the state. And then you have ways of capturing the dynamics and the rules. And then the environment, here for agent-based modeling can be spatial and topological, sort of the dynamics of that surrounding environment. And interventions, or what interventions do you have to consider? These are important things. And ladies and gentlemen, in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a software package which uses exactly this to diagram out a model, to map out a model. We're going to be using that, partly because it helps us think through systematically, partly because it will get us partway through an any logic model, because we'll be putting these things into there. Scott?
Is there a place you can actually place your assumptions in the model?
Sorry?
I mean, the only thing I'm seeing missing from that list, which is very nice, is like, what are your assumptions?
Well, the assumptions are kind of writ for all of this. Like for actions, there's going to be some assumptions associated with that, because you're going to have, well, actions and rules together. You're going to have, someone can only develop active TB from a latent TB state and not directly from the susceptible state upon infection. And so the very delineation of actions and rules incorporates many of the assumptions. Now, you could argue, and I won't dispute it, that sometimes you have assumptions that that transcend sort of what's obvious from listing these out, in terms of kind of what is being put aside or ignored, or what is being treated as exogenous versus endogenous. And for those, you can write it as text. I mean, it's not like I have a specific way of indicating it, reifying it, but it's an interesting idea. Let's see the framework and see if we could better play that out. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I would note here, now when it comes to think about the boundary of the model, if you incorporate something as a state, it implies typically it's changing, or it's likely soon in a version of model to change. This implies that it's in what quantity? Endogenous, exogenous, or ignored? If we have a state used to capture something, say income is captured as a state, or say my weight is captured as a state, is that something that's likely to be endogenous or likely to be exogenous? Endogenous, because it's an aspect that's changing over time. Versus if it were a property, or I would say parameter, then it might be the way it's represented as an exogenous thing. Okay. I think I'll go over this quickly. Okay, so we talked about the importance of context. Now, and of model purpose. The issue here, ladies and gentlemen, is when you are thinking about defining a model boundary, the thing you have to be very cautious about is adding unnecessary levels of detail. Okay, about taking the representation of the agent and representing all sorts of processes that are not directly germane, or at least you can't convince yourself are necessarily required for investigating your research question. And you might say, well, what's the cost of that? Isn't that the safe thing to do? The problem is there's an opportunity cost. If you put those things in, it almost inevitably means you'll have too little time to do something else. You put those things in, you won't be able to investigate something else. So much of modeling is figuring out, it's a triage process. Where should we put our time? Do we want to put it into this area or that area? That model that Kurt was looking at, there's a lot of triage that went into that. Ross talks about, and I think Ross is exactly right, Ross Hammond, that there's a limited complexity budget you have for your model. And you can only spend so much because you have limited time. You have limited resources. You have limited chance to go after empirical evidence. And we can only spend that complexity budget on a finite number of things. And we have to choose for a given model, what do we want to put that budget into what do we want to put that budget? And we can go deeper in one part of the model and shallower in another. We can have a very narrow model with very tightly delimited scope where a lot of things are left out and exogenous, but it goes really deep in one particular area. Or we can have a model that's very broad but shallow. And you could argue that system dynamics aggregate models often are a bit more amenable to broad but shallow aggregate models. And you could argue that agent-based models can be very deep but narrow sometimes, because you really explicate this certain aspect of decision-making in great detail, but you assume a lot of other features. I don't think that's always the division, but you'll sometimes see that. So the point is, folks, we have this limited time, limited resources. We can only do so much. Now, for those of you interested, I'll be right with you, sir. For those of you interested in academic publication, there is a fear out there from some academics, particularly academics from epidemiological background, or those who have significant training in epi, maybe as part of MPH program or as part of public health education, that if your model doesn't include a full accounting of the risk factors, if it doesn't include all the factors that are known to have associations with the outcome of interest, that it will be dismissed by those who read it as incomplete. You will find a fear out there that the model needs to have, and besides it can have mechanically, we can incorporate into an agent-based model, that it needs to have this full set of different variables within it captured for person. So we need to have for the person, we have to have education and income and ethnicity and age and the neighborhood in which they live, and we need to have their history of exposure to the care system in the past or what have you. In other words, you're tempted to put all these things into the model. The thing is that by so doing, you almost guarantee that you won't get a model in a timely fashion, and you may seriously undercut your potential for getting a model at all out of it. It will just take far too long. In the world, if you look at what models are actually published, you will find that that reviewers understand that, and they appreciate the fact there's a limited complexity budget. And some of the most insightful models go really deep on a certain area. They say, this is the area the purpose of this model, its goal, its hook, the thing that it focuses on is this little area. These other things, we will make some assumptions that we will state clearly and unambiguously. We know that they're limited, but they're outside the key focus of the model. We will examine with sensitivity analysis the sensitivity of the results to those assumptions, but we're not going to go into great detail in explicating the dynamics of these factors. Our efforts can be focused in a certain area of the model. And you can get wonderfully insightful results out of that. Is it a full accounting of the textured aspect of the dynamics of a particular epidemiological context? No. But it can be very insightful. It will help you understand unexpected ways how different features might interact in the real world, and therefore advance knowledge. So some of the best models out there that are currently being published, for example, some of Ross's work on the impacts of early, of sort of shaping food preferences, are, very stylized in certain respects. They involve agents wandering through landscapes of chocolate cake and broccoli, and having their food preferences shaped by their exposures to chocolate cake and broccoli. And I can assure you that at least my life that's not a very good characterization of my life. And I don't know what Charles Farm is like, but I think the amount of chocolate cake growing there is probably limited, for better or for worse. But you will find the Schelling segregation model also similarly very simplified but very insightful. There are people out there, and power to them, who aspire to very inclusive models, models that are comprehensive, models that incorporate all these different factors as best we understand them. And I salute those people, but they are undertaking an extremely high bar, and they may find that they do learn a lot, but it'll be very deferred, and they need to have the resources to back them up to make it possible. It is possible to build exquisitely sort of rich models, and there are such models here in Canada. I'd use as an example the POEM model from StatsCan, but even those models, of necessity, have to simplify certain things very greatly. For example, the POEM model has assumed certain statistical relationships between observables that may in fact change under different policy regimes. It has very sort of fixed assumptions about decision making, very fixed assumptions about the latent factors involving health, and just reasons in terms of observables. So suffice it to say, we have a limited budget of complexity. Each model to be published needs some sort of hook where it's invested in a novel way in probing certain understanding dynamically. But not every model needs to be as ambitious as to try to take into account all the factors out there in the world. And often we'll be shortchanging ourselves if we do, because we'll put in all sorts of factors that are not needed. It turns out to be very insensitive to them, and we spend a huge amount of time, investing to get them into the model needlessly. So Sarah, yeah.
Well, I was agreeing. I wanted to agree with you on the importance of this point. That I have noticed in AnyLogic's communication of its own advantages.
Yeah.
Their subscriber list that they have a white paper on how this is a risk-free modeling approach. And so I've thought about that as I understand why it's framed as risk-free, because you're not conducting social experiments in the real world that could have unethical consequences or other costs. But I think that this point about, as the modeler, you don't have unlimited time.
That's right.
There is a risk of making one choice for a net versus
Yeah,
another.
there's risk, and I think it's a beautiful point. And I would, taken in a literal way, and I haven't read that white paper, but taken in a literal sense, the idea that it's truly risk-free seems to me, I could use strong terms for it, but it seems to me, a poor set of characterizations of it. I do think that it's lower risk compared to running a clinical trial involving some new drug, perhaps. But ultimately, look, models are thinking tools. Thinking is fallible. Models are fallible. But if models can help us debug our thinking more quickly, if they can help us learn more quickly, maybe they reduce the risk a lot. But to say that they're truly risk-free is, I think, a little bit of hyperbole.
I find it funny because I was responsible for many years for doing AnyLogic training classes in North America, and that paper that I was reading right into the first slide. Okay, it just talks about how the cover of Andre's book.
Yeah.
Okay, like that's his thing. And I put it. What do you mean by risk-free? It's not risk to the modeler. It's risk to the I use factories all the time. Look, you're not going to turn your factory down to rewritten from the assembly line to test for single generation to see if it works. And I do also say, just like our brother just said, it's not risk-free compared to the otherwise risk. Generally, financial terms, it's much less risk to the point you might consider it risk-free. But there are risks.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, actually. So I'd like to advocate this term here, and this is really important to try to resist the urge, folks. When you're dealing with a model, it may be that the model you're building starts very simple, and it should always start simple, and you will add pieces and it will eventually get rich, but get richer and richer in terms of the set of factors that includes in it. And that's the way it should be, because that's how your learning will develop, and you'll be shaping it as you learn. but try to apply the Yagni principle. You ain't going to need it on an ongoing basis until you have evidence through sensitivity analysis or because you need it for some very concrete reasons. Be cautious about putting elements into the model. Now, fundamentally here, and this is another very important point to emphasize to health scientists, health scientists often are trained to think, not without exception, but are often trained to think about associations between observables in the world. We notice this is associated with that. So, higher infant mortality rates are associated with lower income and poverty. Or we may notice associations between, at the population level between countries with greater levels of primary care representation and health outcomes, et cetera. And those are phenomena that could be explained by a dynamic model. But when building the dynamic model, it's not like it can't address them. It can help explain why we see them. But fundamentally, when you're dealing with these models, you're trying to think, or articulate things in terms of causal pathways. What's affecting what? What are the mechanisms by which different factors are affecting these incomes? And often these pathways will include factors that are not directly observable. Okay, so here we, for example, might be interested in understanding how a move from a low-income neighborhood to a mixed-income neighborhood affects things, and we'll have obesity levels, and it may be that this move ends up affecting several particular elements: neighborhood walkability, recreational space availability. And these ripple through to affect physical activity, sedentary behavior, time spent at home, which ripples through in turn to affect obesity levels. Now, an updated version of this diagram, which I have reciprocal causation as well, where there'll be some of these factors that actually ripple through and affect the occurrence of some of the earlier ones. The point is we're trying to think mechanistically of causal pathways. What are the particular ways in which the variables that we're talking about are observed? And many of these factors may, in fact, be latent. Okay, they may be latent. They're not directly observed. Well, often we will, in order to understand some of these components, we will end up creating causal loop diagrams to illustrate some of these connections, these causal pathways. In this case, it's with caregiver child's mental health. We're looking at factors involving stress levels and toxic stress and allostatic load, and child capacity for self-regulation and self-regulation by the child in its interactions with stress levels by the child, co-regulation on the part of the caregiver, etc. And we'll often use these sort of diagrams to map out sort of our hypotheses for our causal pathways and how these components play a role in them. So in the agent-based and hybrid modeling area, we have used a set of diagrammatic representations to try to map out these linkages. And these show some of them that Jeff has illustrated. I think one recognizes the lion by his claw. So this is from Jeff's online site. And here you see an agent depicted with state charts within them illustrating progressions with respect to different concerns, sort of place them in some sort of network context. They're part of groups that live in a certain geographic context, and there may be certain factors in the external environment that are affecting them. There may be dynamics within the agent that's continuous in nature, captured with system dynamics, for example. So here we might use qualitative mapping, and we'll show interventions using a system dynamics, or excuse me, using a little sort of lightning bolt there. So we might put something like this: parameters are associated with the agent. They're they're associated with a mother, with certain peers, and there's certain states illustrated here. And a given intervention might affect, the occurrence of this transition, for example. Maybe it's to a vaccinated state due to outbreak response intervention, immunization. Or maybe there's parameters associated with the characteristic of this agent. So here, we're trying to kind of map out our thinking about the system in causal fashion using these sort of mechanisms. And we do so visually to try to illustrate the connections. Sometimes it's in the form of a causal loop diagram. Sometimes it's in the form of something closer to this. And often these parameters will be shown as affecting certain transitions just to capture the causality. Here, if something's endogenous, it'll often be associated with a state chart or shown with a variable. It would be associated with a stock and flow. Whereas if something's exogenous, it might be specified as a parameter, for example, for the person or for the environment. So why would you make something endogenous or exogenous in a given round of the model? Well, if for this round of the model, you want to be sure to capture a certain key dynamic behavior in that model, and you don't think you can capture it without this variable being something that the model generates. If you need to capture the effect of an intervention that depends on selecting the group to intervene upon having that characteristic captured in the model. So, it's an intervention on pregnant women. You need to represent pregnancy in your model. If it's an intervention on lower income individuals, there needs to be some attempt in the model to represent income levels. Or if you're concerned how it will be affected by an intervention, you're concerned about transfer effects, where certain parts of the population will be benefited and certain penalized. If you're concerned about if it's needed to capture the effect of the intervention at a causal level, in the sense that maybe the intervention affects the level of immune strength, maybe you need to have some representation of different levels of immune strength. When it's observable and you want to compare it with empirical data, for example, or if it's very important for stakeholder credibility. Jeff talks a lot about how GIS-type functionality can be very important for raising confidence among stakeholders or having a visualization and having the requisite backing for that visualization. So why would you have certain factors as exogenous? Well, if we represent them as exogenous, we can get extra flexibility for capturing effects of interventions or certain exogenous scenarios, greater robustness in the context of change. We can translate the model to a new domain. Rather than hard-coding certain effects in the model, those can be generated by the model, and we can translate it to different contexts more readily. On the other hand, keeping greater detail in the model, endogenous can require more data and implementation work, but it does allow for translation of the model. So when you think about putting something into the model, you want to be careful about these trade-offs because it can involve a lot more work. At the same time, it may buy you some generality or ability to investigate new types of interventions. Okay, I had some examples here, but I think I'm just going to give you the slides rather than going into them because I want to introduce you to a tool, and then I want to actually go to break for your projects. Okay, any questions so far about this? A lot of material. Okay, let's go look at a tool. So I'd like you to call up a browser, okay? And with your browser, we're going to undertake some use of a new tool for qualitative collaborative hybrid modeling. So I'm going to stop this recording, and here we go. Great.